Good morning, Blogging Heads viewers. I am Robert Farley from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky, and with me is Professor John Mueller, Professor of Political Science at Ohio State University. How are you this morning, John?
Great.
Good. John Mueller is the author of, among many other books, Atomic Obsession, which is about, essentially, the world's obsession with atomic and nuclear weapons. And so, John, would you like to talk a little bit about the book?
Yeah, the book basically tries to take a fairly broad-scale look at nuclear weapons and argues they really haven't been very important, certainly since World War II. I don't think they were necessary to deter a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't think they've had much effect. They've been very relevant to most of the crises and other issues that have happened since that time. Nuclear proliferation has been very slow, and I think that's mostly because most countries, when they take a close look at getting a nuclear capacity, conclude that it isn't worth the time, effort, money, and scientific talent. So it's not likely to accelerate. And then even when it has happened, even with supposedly dangerous countries like communist China, they mostly use the weapons purely for deterrence or for stoking their own ego, which are fairly harmless enterprises. The book also argues that non-proliferation policies that lead to the deaths of large numbers of people to deal with worst-case scenario fantasies, as with the case of, for example, Iraq, are really wildly misplaced. And the book also deals with atomic terrorism, arguing that the likelihood that that terrorists would get nuclear weapons is vanishingly small.
Right. You have in one of those chapters, you have a fantastic chart of the 20 steps which terrorists would need to assemble a nuclear device, find all the material, put it together, transport it, and so forth. And there's like 20 steps. And the assumption is even if we sort of radically overstate the chances of any given one of these steps, the actual odds of detonating a nuclear weapon in an American city are somewhere one in the billions, I believe.
Yeah.
I thought that was a very helpful chart.
1 in 3 billion even. Yeah,
right.
It was an interesting exercise. What I did was I just sort of wrote a narrative, particularly following William Languish's book called Atomic Bazaar. So I took that as a starting point and sort of expanded it. Because what he did, as other people haven't done, is look at, okay, you're a terrorist. How are you going to put this bomb together? Well, you have to do this and this and this. And so I went from there and just elaborated considerably. And then once I was through, I just went through and said, okay, how can I bullet this? In other words, have sort of steps, exact steps you have to do. And quickly came up actually with 25 originally. And I thought that was probably too many aesthetically, so I cut it down to 20. And that was actually difficult, so that was a good exercise. Basically, I really think 20 is too small. But each step is one which people say, well, that would be difficult but not impossible. And the other one, that's true. And another step, difficult but not impossible. But if you have enough difficult but not impossible steps, it quickly comes to a situation in which the likelihood of accomplishing the task is incredibly small.
Right. I mean, even as anyone knows with coin flips, the number that you need to get heads a certain number of times is a certain number of consecutive times, especially when the consequences of getting tails at any given time is disastrous for the entire project, right? The entire project falls apart if not everyone in the terrorist organization is able to keep their mouth shut, or if somebody accidentally leaks. And these aren't implausible either, right? Because, I mean, the Soviet Union was unable to do something which would seem fairly covert and simple as deploy nuclear weapons to Cuba without the United States finding out about it. And the idea that a terrorist organization could do all of these things is really fantastic, right? I mean, it's
one of the
fantasy.
One of the things that came out of I hadn't really expected it all that much. It's just that you have to, if you're going to do this, if you're a terrorist, you have to rely essentially on criminals or corrupt officials. In other words, people outside your organization. And every time you trust a criminal, criminals, tend to be pretty good at extortion. So either one of two things can happen. One is they keep asking for more money, or they go to the authorities because the reward money is so spectacular. So it just, and there's a lot, there are basically dozens of places where you have to trust a criminal. And the criminal has to be stayed bought all the way through.
Right, and being bought and staying bought, of course, are different things.
Absolutely.
Let's step back a bit, because I've written a little bit about this in the past, and I investigated way back when, and I think even when I was an undergraduate, I read a lot of stuff about China's decision to go nuclear in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And it reminds me a lot of the rhetoric about, and you discussed this in one of the chapters of the book, the rhetoric about China's decision to go nuclear reminds me a lot, and I think reminds you a lot, of the rhetoric surrounding Iran's decision, or the possible decision to go nuclear.
And to North Korea as well, but particularly Iran. Yeah, you're right.
Right. And it's fascinating because if you go back and read it, the Soviets are almost as obsessed as the Americans are about it. The Soviets are, and a lot of the Sino-Soviet split literature is about how unseriously the Chinese take nuclear weapons and how dangerous nuclear weapons might be in the hands of the Chinese. So it's fascinating that we do see a replay of this conversation, and yet China has been a very responsible nuclear citizen, or a reasonably responsible nuclear citizen in any case.
Yeah. When I looked into that, I found very few people who were saying that at the time, in 1964, which is when China exploded its bomb in the State Department. I found this guy, Robert Johnson, who I dedicate the book to his memory, who was one of the people there, and he was actually saying, well, if they get it, they're just going to sort of squirrel it away. It's not going to change their foreign policy. And that was so unlike what almost everybody else was saying, from John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson on down, but it proved to be exactly right.
Right. I floated the argument to a couple of retired State Department types, and they sort of dutifully returned, well, of course, the Chinese were essentially rational, and the Iranians, we can't trust them to be rational. It's like, well, that's fine. Except nobody was saying that about the Chinese when they were developing nuclear weapons, or virtually no one.
Yeah, quite the reverse. In fact, it attacked China. It attacked India a couple of years earlier. It was engaged in all kinds of helping with a lot of guerrilla warfare. Its rhetoric was off the charts. I mean, Mao was saying things like, "Well, we got 600 million people. The United States has 200 million people. We have a really nice thermonuclear war. The United States has 0 people, and we have 400 million left over. We win." He wasn't presumably totally serious about that, but that kind of casual rhetoric is not exactly the kind of thing that lets you sleep well at night.
Right. If Iran's leaders had engaged in anything approaching the rhetoric that Mao has engaged in, I suspect we'd already be in Tehran. But of course, they haven't.
Right, and China is a much more important country than Iran is, just in the great scheme of things. Exactly.
I think probably the most policy relevant aspects of the book are going to be the discussions of terrorism, where I think you shred the idea that this is really a plausible threat. And one of the points I liked was you talk about, well, we have Dick Cheney's 1% doctrine, which is essentially just, I think as you put it, that we do have to be concerned about low probability, high cost events. But at some point, the low probability is so low that there's just not any point in worrying about it.
Yeah, or certainly getting hysterical about it. Robert Gates says that what keeps everybody awake in the higher levels in the United States, foreign policy establishment keeps them awake at night, is worrying about a nuclear threat, but from a terrorist. And so if my book is successful, these guys will sleep better and they'll have better decision making. And I intend to take total credit for that. If it doesn't happen, it'll be somebody else's fault.
Right. And I suppose the problem is that they may not want to sleep better, right? And they may not want us to sleep better.
Well, maybe they make better decisions with little sleep. I don't know. There'd be another problem there.
Yeah, I suppose. Have you read? So I have a couple questions about the historical part of the argument regarding the Cold War. Have you read Nicholas Thompson's new book, Hawk and Dove?
Yes.
You have read that?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm reading it right now, and so I was reading it and Atomic Obsession together, and there were, I have to admit, there were times at which, and your account of the Cold War, do you want to sort of briefly summarize, for the people who haven't read the book, your account?
Actually putting in Thompson's way of looking at it, the book came out, I think, after my book was already in press, but I've done a short paper dealing with it since that time. The Nukes approach is we really have to worry about the Soviet Union because it has all kinds of arms. The Kennan approach is we don't have to worry about the Soviet Union because it's not going to use the arms. And so the intent, it may have a lot of, Russia still has lots of nuclear weapons, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't worry about them. So and so do the British. The British could kill 20 million Americans anytime they wanted to with their nuclear weapons. We don't worry about that. So it obviously is the intent that matters. And a key thing from my standpoint is that I can see no evidence either during the Cold War or in documents that have come out since the end of the Cold War that the Soviet Union had the slightest interest, whatever, in getting into anything that could remotely resemble a repetition of World War II, with or without nuclear weapons. In other words, essentially there was nothing to deter. They were an anti-status quo power. They didn't want to foment revolution and class warfare and bring countries that had the right kind of mixture of people at the top into their camp. But the idea of Hitlerian aggressive war was just simply not on the agenda. It was not part of their way of looking at the world, and it would be much too risky from their standpoint, even if they started to think about it for a while. They discounted, I think.
Right. The idea that they would just snatch up Western Europe was always kind of absurd. Although it did sort of feed a lot of fodder for a lot of novels, especially in the 1980s. Strangely enough.
Yeah. Well, in the earlier
the John Hackett book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Also,
I mean,
on the aging course, there's also nuclear weapons going off and killing everybody in the world constantly on film. So.
Right. One of the interesting comparisons, though, is that, and I think in this case, actually, your argument sort of almost, I think more broadly your argument is that Soviet intentions were simply never to conquer the world, or at least never to conquer the world in any short period of time, and so that is sort of Kennan-esque. But I think on nuclear weapons...
Yeah, particularly using military force. The idea eventually would be that the hope would be every country in the world would convert to the working class, would throw out the capitalist class, and they'd all be in one big happy family. That would be the idea. That's, you call that conquest. That's taking over the world, I suppose.
Right, revolution's always around the corner. But in terms of the importance of nuclear weapons to the Cold War, it seems to me almost as if your argument is a little bit more Nietzsche-esque than Kennan-esque, because I think Kennan actually viewed nuclear weapons in the same way that Kenneth, or he eventually came to view nuclear weapons in the same way that Kenneth Waltz views them. That nuclear weapons essentially made a conflagration between the United States and the Soviet Union unthinkable. And that it may not have happened anyway, and I think that you can read the X article as saying that we're unlikely to face a major military confrontation. But I think later, I think he came to the conclusion that nuclear weapons were this firewall against war, whereas Nietzsche thought of nuclear weapons as just bigger bombs, right? And reading especially your early chapters where you talk about how outlandish expectations of what a nuclear bomb could be. And you point out that if a small atomic device was detonated in the middle of Central Park, it wouldn't actually affect the buildings around Central Park. That actually reminded me a little bit of Nietzsche.
Yes, I agree with that part. Yeah, in the case of Kennan does say in the later book, Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin, that he really basically can't see any reason why the Soviet Union, with or without nuclear weapons, would ever start a major war. Mm-hmm. I suppose, Kennan was very much afraid of nuclear weapons and wanted to get rid of them. And my position is neither Waltzian nor that. Mainly that they'll probably fade away in time and they're not that big a deal. And so the fact that they're there doesn't scare me, though I'd be perfectly happy if they go away.
Right. Well, sort of along those lines, I suppose, do you think that and we're going to bounce around a little bit here, but do you think that President Obama's sort of renewal of Reagan's call for zero nuclear weapons, do you think this is helpful at all, or do you think that nuclear weapons should simply be allowed to fade away rather than I guess be snuffed out as they would through some sort of concerted multilateral action?
Yeah, well, that kind of proposal is good for winning the Nobel Peace Prize, so I can't discount it completely, right? In general, I think the weapons are most likely to go away if you just sort of forget about them. There has been, since the end of the Cold War, intentions really, there's a phrase, for example, that arms control is like trying to cure a fever by destroying the thermometer. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's quite fair, but the reverse tends to work. When a fever goes away, you tend to forget where you put the thermometer. And since the end of the Cold War, there's been a huge reduction in nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, though there's still a lot of them there. Some of that's been accomplished by treaty, but much of it is not. In some cases, they do a treaty and they disarm faster than the treaty says they should disarm. And similarly, the French have cut their nuclear weapons to a third of what they had before. I don't quite know why they need even a third, but nonetheless, that's a reduction. So I think, generally speaking, what happens is when tensions go away, people tend to get rid of the weapons. And they're more likely to do that if there isn't an agreement. Because if there's an agreement, say each side has to only have 1,000 or something like that, everybody's going to look very, very carefully at that because they know that they're bound not to have more than 1,000. If there isn't a treaty, they might well go below 1,000 because they know, well, if something gets bad, we can always build some more back up.
Right, they don't feel constrained or bound, and so they don't worry as much about the actual falling of numbers because they can, as you pointed out, they can always rebuild.
Yeah, it becomes sort of a market thing. Well, there isn't much threat, so we don't need these bloody things, but if the threat goes up, we'll build some more. So therefore, you're more likely to reduce weapons than you are if you have a treaty, because if you do a treaty, every lawyer in the world has to be in on nuance after nuance. And you don't want to commit yourself to something that you think in the future you might that you might need them in the future. So in many respects, they would just go away. That happened. There used to be an arms race between the United States and British Canada. It was an arms race in the warships, particularly in forts and things like that. Mm-hmm. Tensions went away in the 1870s, and eventually so did the forts. They're still there, but they're now museums with cannon pointed impotently at each other. And there's never been another treaty. There never was a single treaty. They just went away. Right. Or allowed to rust in peace, as I put it.
Right. Well, what do you think of the argument? Richard Rhodes, I think, makes this argument that even to the extent that the arms control agreements, and this is the mid-'80s, I think, he's talking specifically about the mid-'80s stage of arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, even to the extent that they didn't actually reduce stockpiles all that much. What they did do was signal to both sides an interest in peace, an interest in cooperation on the other side. And he thought that this was particularly relevant on the Soviet side, where his argument was that Reagan's rhetoric, among other things, and the early 1980s buildup had really made the Soviets crazy paranoid. And so that, even to the extent we can't say that the nuclear arms agreements in the late 1980s actually reduced the stockpiles all that much, the effort to engage in arms control behavior convinced or empowered certain aspects of the Soviet leadership to win domestic victories over Soviet hardliners.
Yeah, I think that's partly true, and I do. These things have atmospheric impact. The Assault 1 Treaty, for example, 1972, basically from a military standpoint, was totally stupid because it encouraged both sides to build exactly the wrong kind of weapons to enable first strike capability. On the other hand, the atmospherics were absolutely terrific. So from that standpoint, I think the tension reducing effect was good there. But what we have now is we don't have tensions of that sort. And so it's not clear that you really need them. Also, even during that time, I've got a quote in there from Mel Leffler's book dealing with Brezhnev. And Brezhnev is saying we have to build up weapons so that the Americans will take us seriously so we can negotiate to get rid of the weapons.
Which is exactly what Nitze was saying. Which is exactly what Nitze was saying on the American side, that we can't not build this because we have to be able to bargain it away. Yeah,
that's right. Or the phrase is bargaining chips. Even if someone says, this is a really stupid weapon system, it's costing us a bundle. The response is, yeah, but we can use it as a bargaining chip with the Soviets. And so therefore we have to keep it up. Therefore, the fact that there were arms control negotiations was causing weapons to exist that otherwise probably wouldn't have.
Right. And there's echoes of that in the entire discussion over missile defense in Eastern Europe, right? Where there was almost no principled technical argument in favor of building a missile defense system in Poland and Czechoslovakia, or in Poland and the Czech Republic. And the only defense that people came down is that if we and that you could still make this argument in 2009 and people would pay attention, that we'll look weak in front of the Russians. It's a golden oldie, I guess. I was fascinated by how people made that argument in terms of the missile defense system.
But it means that basically, if you don't have the negotiations or the possibility of negotiating or coming to an agreement on them, the weapons might very well not exist because of their obvious uselessness.
Right.
So the arms control negotiations caused weapons to exist.
Right. What have you? There was and unfortunately, it's not available online as far as I know. The Darryl Press and Keir Lieber have a new article out in Foreign Affairs. Of course, they recently, or 2 or 3 years ago, wrote an article saying that the United States had essentially achieved presumptive nuclear superiority, and we could wipe out the Russians and Chinese.
International security, yes.
What's that?
Yeah, in international security, the second article is, yeah.
Right, well, they had a foreign affairs and international security.
Right.
And they have another one in foreign affairs now, which is essentially taking the argument a step farther and saying that the United States should really gear its policy towards nuclear supremacy, towards being able to destroy the Chinese nuclear deterrent on the ground in case we ever get... And reading this right after reading your book was fascinating because they say it is inevitable that we will be engaged in conventional combat against a nuclear armed adversary, and they mentioned China specifically in there, and it was like, well, is it really inevitable? They say it's inevitable, and so they say, rather than nuclear weapons fading away, the United States needs to take now a proactive stance towards redesigning its nuclear arsenal for absolute nuclear supremacy.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of people running around trying to figure out what these stupid weapons should be kept around for. Another thing is bunker bursting and so forth, and various exotic potential uses of radiation and so forth. A lot of scientists have to be kept going, and so do some strategists. But basically, obviously, I disagree. In the case of China, what's really remarkable is how small their arsenal is. They could have much, much larger arsenal. And so basically proposals that of this sort would tend to be encouraging to China to rethink its policy and possibly become a better nuclear-armed country. It doesn't strike me as being a very good thing for anybody, including China.
Well, sure, and one of the implications when drawn out is that if the United States achieves nuclear superiority, absolute nuclear primacy, that we'll need to keep it, right? And that's even vastly more dangerous than the idea we need to keep nuclear equality with the Soviets, because then we just need to build as many as they do. If nuclear primacy becomes a key goal of United States foreign policy, then we really have to build many, many, many more than they do. And so,
in fact, it's a little bit hard to see what the upper limit would even be. How much is enough?
Right. We just need 10 times, 15 times as many as they do at any given time, and that seems like a fantastic recipe for building an infinite number of nuclear weapons.
And we see how great these weapons have helped the United States and Iran and in Afghanistan, how great they helped the British in the Falklands, and how much they helped the French in Algeria, and how much they helped the Chinese with Vietnam in their short war. They basically have been militarily useless.
Right, and I think this argument needs to be pursued farther, because when you actually talk to Israelis, and serious Israelis, they will rarely argue that, if they understand that and this is sort of part of the Israeli strategic class, they will very rarely argue that Iran is likely to fire off a nuclear weapon randomly or suicidally. Or at least they will rarely argue that if they know that you know what you're talking about. But they will then argue that, well, in fact, what the nuclear weapon will do will be to give Iran additional leverage, and it'll be able to accomplish all of its hopes and dreams and goals if it just has one of these nuclear weapons back in the stable. And the argument is self-evidently absurd, right?
Yeah. Well, it was used with Saddam Hussein. It's the nuclear dominance. And I'm amazed how little that argument has been tackled. Steve Walt did an article, which I referenced in the book, an edited book. It was one of the few cases where he said, suppose they get the bomb. And they start rattling their rockets. What are the other countries against whom they are rattling their rockets going to do? Right. Well, the most likely thing they're going to do is coalesce themselves into an alliance of convenience to oppose the threat, including probably Israel, as well as the United States and Russia. So the idea that say Saddam rattles a rocket or the Iranians do, that everybody says, okay, what do you want? Higher oil prices, lower oil prices. They're not going to do that. What they're going to do is stand up as to the threat. The very good case, obviously, is when Saddam Hussein, it's a nuclear case, but when he attacked Kuwait in 1990. Everybody in the world, basically every country in the world, virtually, coalesced in a coalition against that. They disagreed sometimes about what tactics would be used to undo it, but everybody agreed it was simply not acceptable. It was not that they all said, wow, he's got Kuwait, therefore I'm so terrified I'm going to do anything he says. And that's what the argument you're bringing up basically suggests, and it just seems to be extremely faulty.
Right, and as others pointed out, the United States and Israel possess nuclear weapons, and we are not able to achieve all of our outcomes, all of our desired outcomes in the Middle East. Certainly not the Israeli. I don't even think Israelis feel more secure now than they did 20 years ago. If anything, I think that they feel less secure in spite of growing Israeli military dominance over any potential adversary.
I think that's right. They do live in a very small country, of course, and with concentrations of population concentrations. So it's understandable they see themselves as particularly vulnerable. But the notion that someone would attack them knowingly, like Iran, with which they could then retaliate with their 100, 200 weapons they have, the Israelis, not to mention the Russians or the United States, And just simply discounting that just seems absurd to me. The danger from the Israeli standpoint is they're working themselves into a state of hysteria over this. One phrase you can't use, as far as I can see, is Israel can live with an Iranian bomb. And they simply, they can't, some really good friends of mine, I know for 20 years and so forth, you bring up that argument and they go ballistic, Israelis. And I just think they're wrong about that. I'd certainly be very happy if Iran never gets the bomb. It's not at all obvious they're going to get it anyway, but they'd be happy that they didn't get it. But if they do get it, they can be contained and deterred just as easily, readily as anybody else. It seems to me probably more so, actually.
Right. Prime Minister Omer visited the University of Kentucky, I want to say 3 weeks ago. He made the argument to our students, I actually wasn't there, but it was reported to me, that a single Iranian bomb could destroy the Israeli state and could destroy the Israeli capacity to retaliate, which would make deterrence irrelevant because the United States would never fire back at Iran for a state that no longer existed.
That's nonsense. Well, a single bomb?
Yeah,
that's technological nonsense. Unless all the Israelis have every single one of their nuclear weapons in the same 2 square mile area.
In downtown Tel Aviv, right? And that seems unlikely.
Yeah, that's a bizarre argument to make. If he really said just one bomb could do it, obviously a whole bunch of them could. Actually, even a whole bunch of them. I don't know where. Obviously, neither I nor the Iranians know where the nuclear weapons in Israel are, and the Israelis are certainly not going to tell anybody. But I assume they're widely dispersed, and it would take one nuclear weapon to knock out each of those nuclear weapons, probably, or their delivery systems.
Right,
which would mean you'd have to do 200 or 300 of them, maybe.
Right, given Israeli missile defenses too, you could never.
Yeah, but not even counting the missile defense. Yeah, that's right. I agree.
Right. A couple other questions. You don't deal, and I use this term advisedly, but you don't deal with the EMP nutters. Are you at all familiar with the EMP argument? The EMP brigade?
Yeah. I think I put it in a back note. Okay. There's a guy named Lawrence who used to be head of the Los Alamos lab on weapons design, and in a recent book, he asked somebody who knew all about EMP about that, and the idea that North Koreans can do that and basically wipe out the communications within the United States with a single bomb. I mean, right now they don't have, their delivery system can barely hit the Pacific Ocean. But anyway, but the guy he talked to said that they're just like, he didn't think the United States could do that. Right. And it just seems to be, Newt Gingrich is running with this a lot, of course. And
Mike Huckabee is too, which is what I found kind of odd. For those of you who aren't, those of our viewers who aren't 100% familiar with this, the EMP obsession essentially takes the atomic obsession to what we might call its natural end, and argues that a terrorist organization or a rogue state would be able to fire a missile carrying one small atomic warhead, and in the most at the furthest elements of this argument, the warhead is literally like a 14 to 20 kiloton atomic warhead, detonated at some height above, some altitude above the United States.
Yeah, very high.
Right, very high. And the way that a terrorist organization gets it there is that they put the Scud missile on a barge and then sail it off the East Coast, which, I think adds like another 35 steps to your list there of things that terrorist organizations will have to do. They fire the missile, and then that missile wipes out the communications in the United States and all electronic equipment, and kills 90% of Americans within a year, because Americans without their cell phones will die.
Right. Well, don't to mention they wouldn't be able to look at television either. That'd be really rough.
Right. And you would not believe that people could actually make this argument, but in fact they do. Frank Gaffney, they recently had a big convention up in Niagara making this argument, and Mike Huckabee attended, and Newt Gingrich attended. And it's really the atomic obsession squared, right? I mean, it's the logical conclusion where a single enemy bomb could destroy all of the United States, or virtually all of the United States.
And it is a technological feat which would be fantastically high, and it's not at all. Of course, it would kill nobody directly, even if it did happen. And the question is, can people get away, figure out other ways to communicate? And what the most likely thing would happen is that people would improvise, or even if it's true, people would improvise communications. It would be, it would be a problem, obviously. But just the technological, the feat, the ability to do that technologically is fantastically high. It takes a huge
right.
amount of capacity to do that, even begin to do that.
Right. It's sad that even Heritage seems to have picked it up a little bit, which I don't know that I should, but sometimes I do expect a little bit better of Heritage.
Got some good people.
Yeah. What you don't deal a lot with the what I think most people call the Sagan critique of nuclear proliferation, which isn't necessarily that any state is going to make an intentional decision to use an atomic weapon or use a nuclear weapon. I mean, I think you sort of deal with the Sagan critique is that the real threat from nuclear proliferation is not that states will even accidentally fire a nuclear weapon off, but that accidents are inevitable, and that at some point you are going to have a nuclear accident somewhere, and it's probably going to be bad. May not start a global thermonuclear war, but even if a single nuclear weapon goes off somewhere accidentally, it will kill a lot of people, it will cause a lot of problems, and thus we really should engage in serious, robust non-proliferation efforts, because accidents are inevitable. And we know this because even the Soviet Union and the United States have come very close to accidents. And you can't necessarily expect that every country in the world is going to be as careful with its weapons as the U.S. and the Soviet Union were.
Yeah, I deal with the accidents somewhat. I mean, that's an argument that's been used for centuries, of course. And, of course, there are far fewer nuclear weapons now than there were during the Cold War, with the disarmament that's taken place, particularly in the United States and the Soviet Union and other countries as well. During that same period of time, accident prevention measures have gotten ever better. And there's some very simple ones that are really totally effective, which is like, for example, in Pakistan, the bombs are kept in pieces, 2 pieces. So they couldn't possibly go off accidentally. And also the idea that if a bomb goes off, it's necessarily going to kill large numbers of people, but if it goes off accidentally. I mean, if it's in a submarine, it's not going to kill very many people except the people on the submarine. Right. And most of the weapons are secured in bases that are not, they don't put them in Times Square. And furthermore, that this would trigger everybody else. I mean, if a bomb goes off in Peoria, Illinois, the Russians are not going to suddenly attack the United States. Even during the Cold War, that wouldn't have happened. If a single bomb goes off in Peoria, Illinois, you'd say something, this is a big accident, which is what it would be. The point is everybody doesn't start pushing all their buttons simultaneously because of that. So the whole cascade of causation is very questionable, it seems to me.
Right. That not everybody's sitting on a hair trigger, either in terms of launching the weapons right away or a hair trigger in terms of decisions to proliferate.
Yeah, in fact, the hair triggeredness is becoming less so. In the case of Pakistan and India, for example, neither one really sees this in the Cold War terms of, first strike, second strike, knocking out the other guy's capacity immediately. They both basically see it, I think, as a sort of the final possibility, the ultimate, if things really get out of hand and disastrous, we might want to use them. So they're not on a hair trigger thing. These are things they keep in the basement, essentially, for possible use if things really get bad. They are not saying we have to launch these things in 12 seconds.
Right. Although a strategy of nuclear primacy might make them more nervous about if the United States or even China adopted a strategy of nuclear supremacy, that might make them more hair trigger.
Yeah, it's possible. It also means that they're more likely to distrust the United States in terms of protection. It's already happened with Pakistan. I mean, in the campaign last year, the Democrats are talking about how they might, use nuclear weapons against Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and so forth. Well, from a Pakistani standpoint, that is a little bit unsettling. And so they've been unwilling to let the Americans know where their weapons are because of fear that the United States, at some whim or other, might blow them up. And the United States, of course, wants Pakistan to have the most sophisticated protection measures possible on their bombs. The Pakistanis agree with that. But they won't bring the Americans to look at their bombs. Instead, they say, if you want to train us, you have to take us to the United States, train our guys there, then they'll come back to wherever our weapons are, and we're not going to tell you, and apply the safety measures there. So to that degree, the American threat is reducing safety some.
To close, although we can still talk about other things, but you talk a lot about the themes that are major in the book. It's atomic obsession. You make the case that there is an obsession with atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. You make the case that that this obsession is wrong-headed in many ways, both from metastasizing the effects of nuclear weapons to overstating their relevance to history to overstating the threat of a nuclear terrorist attack and so forth.
That sounds like the book, right?
What's that?
That sounds like the book, right?
Yeah. Do you discuss, and of course I read the book, but maybe I just don't remember, why there is an atomic obsession? This is, and you point out that in the wake of World War I there was a chemical weapons obsession, despite the fact that chemical weapons did not have the even close to the same impact as conventional munitions during the war. Why is there this obsession with these unconventional types of weapons, and especially nuclear weapons? If we really are overstating, we can argue as academics we're really overstating their effect on history, but why do people so consistently overstate their effect on history? We know what the effect is, but why is there this overstatement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I really nail it in the book by any means. It's hard to know because certain weapons seem to have that effect. Napalm is another one. Why burning people to death is worse than shooting with bullets or shrapnel is not particularly clear. So there's certain weapons that sometimes pick up this onus. In the case, I think it has something to do with the horrible way people die. In the case of gas, the idea is when gas was first used, it was in World War I, it was chlorine gas, which causes people basically to drown. What happens is their lungs fill up and they can't breathe and they suffocate. So that's really sort of horrible, though, and somehow that seems to be more horrible than being shot with a bullet. And so some of the initial propaganda, particularly by the British in World War I, since the Germans used gas first, and so consequently the British wanted to show how inhumane the Germans were, so they stressed that argument and it caught on. In nuclear weapons, I suppose it has something to do with the radiation thing. There's something horrible about cancer, of course, but why cancer? Just think about why people are more afraid of cancer than heart disease. Why? They're more or less equal killers. Actually, heart disease is a bigger killer, but somehow there's something about this gnawing from within or something that causes people to do it, to feel that way. It's a psychological thing. It's not clear where it happens. There's certainly people who've been running with that. After World War II, the scientists in particular, the people, Manhattan Project scientists and others, were very concerned about, they wanted to scare people to peace, essentially. Right. So they tended to do a lot of hyping about how horrible these weapons were, and they found a receptive audience. But the key thing is they found a receptive audience. The point is, if it didn't work, they wouldn't have used it. They would have stopped using it. Right. And so somehow people are responsive to that. They're responsive to the gas argument after World War I. They were responsive to the nuclear argument after World War II. They're less responsive to, bullets and shrapnel. So I don't know what working it out precisely would be hard, but there seems to be no question that we've had this kind of revulsion for certain kinds of ways of killing people as opposed to others.
Right. And it's fascinating, and again you point this out too, that the hyping of the obsession doesn't seem to have its intended effect. If the intended effect is to describe to people how horrible the weapons are, it seems almost as if the hyping has come at the same time that there were significant nuclear weapons buildups. And you mentioned the early 80s where in popular culture, I think you had a growing conclusion that nuclear weapons were horrible and would destroy the entire world. We have War Games, we have The Day After, and other films about how horrific nuclear war would be. At the same time that, we're having one of the biggest nuclear buildups and serious nuclear tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so creating the hysterical obsession doesn't seem to actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons that we have.
Yeah, a big danger about saying how horrible these weapons are is to say, well, we better have more of them than the other guy then, right? And so there's a danger that actually helps the hawks. That was, I think, the case, certainly with nuclear weapons. So it's counterproductive from the standpoint of the people. Obviously, if exaggerating the effect and getting hysterical about nuclear weapons would mean that they'd never be used, and that they'd actually could be gotten rid of, then these people would say, well, that's well worth the exaggeration. But instead, the reverse largely happened.
Well, I don't think I have anything else to ask. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, you've done a pretty good job of covering the whole book there, I think, overall.
Well, it's an excellent book, and I hope that it will find a lot of traction because I think it's a very useful corrective to how nuclear weapons are understood.
Thanks very much, Rob.
All right, thanks a lot, John.
Okay, bye.